Can you hear me now? Can everybody hear me now? Sorry about that. I had my mic turned off, it seems. That's why we do these tests. Perfect. Okay, great. Looks like everyone can hear me now. Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to get started. We've got 30 of you joined in with us today, which is great, and we might have a few more joining in as we go. So today is the first session of a 3-session series that I will be doing for the next 3 weeks, starting today. And we're going to be focusing in on the 3 different macronutrients. So as you probably know, today we're focusing in on fats, and then we're also going to be doing, I think, carbohydrates next week and protein the week after that, every week on Wednesday at the same time. So this is the first one. I'll encourage you at the end, I'll provide links so you can register for the next 2. That would be great so that you can have a good idea of all 3 of the macronutrients. But today we will be focusing mainly on fats and going into detail about sort of what it is and what it does in our bodies, and where we can get good sources of fat and how to make healthy decisions and all of that good stuff. So that's the plan for today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Madison Walsh. I'm a health promotion specialist in Halifax at CFB Halifax. I have a master's of public health, and I'm also a registered dietitian. So, of course, talking about nutrition is my favorite thing. So please feel free to ask questions as we go. If you have any questions about the material or about fat, I'll be happy to answer them as we go along. And it looks like everyone can still hear me. A couple people are still saying hello. That's great. Looks like everyone's figured out the chat function. So that would be where you go and ask any questions. If you have them, you would use the chat function as we go along. And I'm also going to be using a few different poll functions throughout the presentation just to make it a little more interactive. So we'll be making use of those. Wonderful. It looks like we have people from all over Ontario for sure. That's great. And I'm way over here in Halifax. Pretty cool that we can be doing this, huh? Okay, so we're going to get started and jump into the material. So just before we go too deep into our topic for the day, there's just a few things that we need to go over in regard to the presentation. So this presentation is the intellectual property of the Department of National Defense. So please don't be recording or taking pictures or trying to reproduce this presentation for that reason. Also, just note that all of our presentations through these webinars are intended for an adult audience. So we ask people to use parental discretion if you have children at home running around or sitting on your lap or whatever it may be. This particular presentation is not probably something that you need to worry about since we're just talking about food and nutrition. But that's not my decision to make. We leave it up to you. So if you feel that you just want to remove your children from the area, just in case, we do ask that you make that decision yourself. Thirdly, make sure that we're keeping privacy. So if anyone does share any information in the chat, any personal stories or information, that stays with us and we don't share that outside of here. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available on the cafconnection.ca website for you to view later, or you can recommend it to your friends if you'd like. So you can also participate, like I said, through the chat and through the polls, and all of that will be available for viewing at a later date online. So that's really great. So if you miss anything, you can always go back and rewatch it. Okay, one more final thing before we jump into our topic of fats. So I will post a poll here, and once I do, you'll see it appear next to the chat function, and I'd love to know what your affiliation is with the CAF community. So if you could let me know, there's a few different options you can check. I'm sharing that poll now. It should be live right next to the chat box, and you can please let me know. That would be great. This is completely anonymous, so there's none of your personal information will be connected to your answer. We just like to know who is watching so that we can make sure we're targeting the right audience. So that's great. Looks like we've had most people answer, not quite everyone. There's 31 of us and I've only had 27. So if everyone could make sure that they answer at some point throughout this presentation, that would be great, just so that we have a good understanding of who is watching. Wonderful, I really appreciate that. Okay, moving on now. So just to give a brief summary, like I said, we're going to be talking about each one of the macronutrients over 3 weeks. Today, we're focusing in on the one in the middle, which is fats, and then carbs, I believe, is next week, and proteins the week after. So that's the plan. If you do have questions about carbs or proteins, try to leave them for the upcoming weeks, and we'll focus as much as we can on fats for today. Okay. So before I start talking to you guys, I'm going to do a quick little test your knowledge just to keep it engaging and fun. So we have 8 questions, and I just want to see sort of what you guys already know about fats and see where we all stand before we dive into the material. So each question I'm going to have a poll for as well, and you can put your answer. Again, they are anonymous, so no one will know what your answer was. So we'll post this one here first, and it says that fat is solid at room temperature. Which fat is solid at room temperature? See if you know. Okay. Still got a few people answering. Wonderful. So it looks like most people, over half of you, have said saturated fat. So saturated fat is the correct answer. So well done if you guessed that. Unsaturated fat is liquid at room temperature, although I think I may have just given away that answer for one of the other questions. And so we'll move on, and we won't give too much away. I probably shouldn't have said that. But here we go. Now everyone knows number 2. My bad. There you go. You can all get this one right. Go ahead and answer this one. Yeah, unsaturated fat. Exactly. Wonderful. Okay, I won't give away anything for the next one this time. Number 3, this fat is found in hydrogenated oils. There you go. Okay. So the answer for this one is, in fact, trans fat. So well done if you guessed trans fat. That is the correct answer. And we're going to go into the details of explaining all of these later. I just don't want to give away any more answers, so I'm not going to talk too much about them. But I will be sure to explain the answers in the presentation. So don't worry if you're confused about one of the answers. Okay, number 4. These 2 fats are linked with health concerns. And it's going live now. Okay, so the correct answers are you only able to answer one question? I just realized maybe you're only able to select one rather than 2, which might make it more difficult. But for those of you that selected either saturated or trans, you would be correct. Yeah, only 1, people are saying. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't think of that for this question, but if you said one or the other, then you are correct. It's both saturated and trans fats are both, in certain cases, linked with health concerns, and we're going to talk about those later on in the presentation. So great job. Okay, number 5. This fat is found in large amounts in food of animal origin, palm oil, and coconut oil. There you go. Okay, correct answer here. This looks like people weren't quite sure on this one, but the correct answer is saturated fat. So saturated fat is the fat that we find in animal proteins, as well as our tropical oils like palm and coconut oil. Okay. Number 6, it's recommended to eat fish because it is a good source of which of these fats? There you go. Great. Okay, most people got this one right. It is omega-3 fat. That is common in fish, and that's the one we talk about a lot when we're recommending to eat lots of fish. Okay, number 7. This essential fat is found in most vegetable oils. There we go. Okay, looks like the majority of people knew this one. So the answer is omega-6. Omega-6 is an essential fat, and we'll talk more about what that means later. It is also an unsaturated fat, so if you said unsaturated fat, then you're not wrong. It is a type of unsaturated fat, but that's just the broader category. So not all unsaturated fats are an essential fat found in vegetable oil, but we're talking specifically about omega-6 in this case. All right, and last question before we move on. This fat is found in avocado. Let's see if we know this one. We got lots of answers all over the board this time. So in general, we're talking about unsaturated fat here. So avocados have unsaturated fat. They do have some omega-3 fats, so you're not wrong if you've said that as well. But just as from a broader standpoint, avocados are a source of unsaturated fat. So that would be the answer that we were looking for there. Wonderful. Okay. So that gives me kind of a rough idea of what we already know, which is really helpful. And now we're going to jump in, and I am going to give lots more explanation for some of those answers, as well as lots of more details about fats. Before I do, for the next part of this presentation, I'm going to turn off my video just so that you can read the slides a bit better. It will make the presentation a bit bigger when my face isn't there. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, so you'll still be able to hear me. You just won't be able to see me. And you'll be able to see the slides better so that you can read them a bit more clearly. So we'll do that, and then we're gonna get started. The three main macronutrients along with carbohydrates and protein. It is a necessary part of our diet, mainly because it provides us with energy as well as performs many, many other functions that we're gonna look into. And really the important thing to keep in mind as we're going through this presentation is that fat is not the enemy. It really does get a bit of a bad reputation. It has in the past been something that people have tried to avoid in large amounts, but there are lots of types of fats that are really great for us and really healthy, and we do want to include fat as part of a healthy, balanced diet. So we're going to talk about how we can do that and which ones to look for as the healthiest, but overall it's just really important to remember that fat is not all bad, and we shouldn't be just avoiding it altogether. So that's the takeaway from that. Okay. So here we go. Why is fat important? Like I said, it provides energy, but it also does so much more. So here are just a few more things that fat will do in our body. So it does provide us with a source of essential fatty acids, and we're going to talk more about that, but essentially we cannot produce these essential fatty acids in our body, so we're required to get them from food sources of fat. So it's actually necessary in order for us to live, for us to consume these types of fats, because we cannot produce them in our body, but we do need them for certain functions. Fat also helps us to absorb fat-soluble vitamins. So the fat-soluble vitamins include vitamin A, D, E, and K. So those 4 vitamins are fat-soluble, which means that they require us to have fat as part of our diet in order for them to be best absorbed into our body and utilized. So it's really important that we're eating fat in our diet so that those vitamins can be best used. Fat also serves as a building block of hormones. It helps to make you feel satisfied after a meal, so it helps keep you feel more full. And it helps to make your food taste good or be more palatable. So it really helps you to enjoy your meals because it really gives it a nice texture and a nice flavor. Okay, so before we go into the different types of fat and what they do in our body, I thought we should first talk about cholesterol, because this is often a topic that's really closely tied with fat, and it's really important to have a good understanding of what cholesterol is and what we mean when we're talking about cholesterol before we talk about the details of fat. So cholesterol is essentially a waxy fat-like substance. It is sort of a type of fat. It's this waxy substance that we are required to have in our body. So we do need some cholesterol in order for our bodies to function optimally. And cholesterol is made by the cells of animals. Basically, all animal cells produce cholesterol because it is an essential component of cell structure. So because of that, certain foods are sources of cholesterol. But when we consume food sources of cholesterol, for example, one really popular source that everyone seems to know about is eggs, like I have a picture of here. So eggs do have a fair amount of cholesterol. However, when we consume cholesterol in our food, it does not affect our blood cholesterol levels. And those levels of cholesterol in your blood are really what's important when we're talking about health. So I think most people would have the broad understanding that we want lower levels of cholesterol, particularly certain types, and we're going to talk about those certain types here in a moment. But it's important to know that when we consume food that has cholesterol, if it says it has cholesterol on the label, it really does not have a very big effect on the levels of cholesterol in your blood. So what does have a big effect on the levels of cholesterol in your blood is triglycerides. So when we consume triglycerides, they are converted into cholesterol in the body, and this does affect your blood cholesterol. So I think that's a really important distinction because we don't necessarily need to avoid cholesterol if it says cholesterol on the food label. Okay, I see someone says, thank you for saying that. Which part, Michelle? I don't remember which part you're thanking me, but anyway, hopefully all of it you enjoyed. Anyway, so this is an important and very key point. Some other sources of cholesterol, shrimp is another common one that does have cholesterol, but again, we don't need to be avoiding eggs, we don't need to be avoiding shrimp or anything else that has cholesterol because it does not affect our cholesterol levels. Okay, we have another question here too, Michael. How do you balance how much you intake? Are you referring to cholesterol in that question, Michael? Just to make sure I'm clear on what you're asking. Yes, or fat. So I'm still not exactly sure what you mean. So in terms of balancing regarding blood cholesterol levels. Oh, okay. Yes, perfect. In terms of balancing, really the key is just to eat a balanced diet. So if you're eating a variety of different types of foods, then you're probably also balancing out how much fat or how much cholesterol you're consuming. So, you know, if you sat down and you ate eggs for an entire week and only eggs, then yeah, that's probably not a great idea because you're probably consuming more eggs than your body really knows what to do with. And that, you know, would probably not be good. But if you're eating a balanced diet and having eggs, you know, just every now and then, or like in the mornings, once in a while, then that's absolutely nothing to worry about. Same thing with different types of fat. So it's all about moderation and variety, and that's really the key to balancing how much of anything that you're getting, whether we're talking about a macronutrient or a micronutrient like a vitamin or a mineral. Same thing applies. If we're eating a variety of different types of foods, then we're probably doing a pretty good job balancing out how much we're getting. So hopefully that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't. I tried my best with that one. Okay, perfect, great. All right, so now we're going to talk about LDL and HDL. So I'm assuming probably most people have heard of these, but I think it's really important to just go over exactly what we mean when we're talking about LDL and HDL cholesterol. So basically what they are, they're not actually cholesterol, although they're often referred to as LDL and HDL cholesterol. They're actually lipoproteins that carry cholesterol throughout the body. So they carry the cholesterol, which is why they're kind of called cholesterol, because they do bring it through our body and carry it around. But they're not actually the same as cholesterol. So that's an important distinction, first of all. And then we kind of have the angel and the devil here, which is to say that one is the good kind and one is the bad kind. And that's often how it's portrayed. And it's not necessarily wrong. So basically, the reason why one is considered good and one is considered bad is that LDL, the bad one, as you can see, the little devil there, what it does is carries cholesterol to the body cells. So that's not necessarily always bad because, like I said, we do need a certain amount of cholesterol in order for our cells and our bodies to function properly. But we also don't need too much of it, or else if we get too high levels of cholesterol, then we will have increased risk for heart disease. So if we have too high levels of LDL cholesterol, then or LDL lipoproteins, then our cholesterol is going to build up in our cells, and that can lead to an increased risk for heart disease. On the other hand, HDL actually absorbs cholesterol and carries it back to the liver for it to be removed from the body. So it really does the opposite function of the LDL. Instead of delivering the cholesterol to our cells, it takes it away from the cells, the excess, and it helps to remove it from the body. So if we have more of the HDL lipoprotein, then we will actually find that our cholesterol levels will decrease. And so if we have those high levels of HDL, then we find that we have a decreased risk of heart disease. So that's kind of the back and forth role that these two types of lipoproteins play and how they're connected to our diet and to cholesterol. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions on that. I just think it's really important to give a quick summary of cholesterol and these types of lipoproteins before we jump into fat. Another key point that I want to discuss is something called atherosclerosis. So it's a huge word, but basically what I mean when I say atherosclerosis is a buildup of plaque in your blood vessels. So if you have too much cholesterol in your blood, it can actually build up on the walls of your blood vessels and results in what we commonly know as plaque. So if there's a buildup of plaque over time, it builds up and builds up and builds up and ends up actually narrowing the blood vessels, which limits the amount of blood that can flow through your vessels, whether to your cells or back to your heart. Either way, it's not good because, of course, as we know, we need our blood to flow through our body at a specific rate in a specific amount in order to provide us with all of the nutrients that the blood carries, as well as oxygen to all of our cells. So it's really important that we have enough blood flowing through our vessels. And if we don't, then in the worst case scenario, it can actually eventually result in a heart attack or stroke. So that's kind of the connection between cholesterol and heart disease. That's really where it happens, is that if we have too much of that LDL cholesterol that's delivering and delivering and delivering cholesterol to our body and to our cells, it will eventually build up because it's too high and our body doesn't know what to do with it, and that can cause that narrowing of the blood vessels. So I have a little image here just to demonstrate how that happens. So as you can see on the left, you have a perfectly normal blood vessel. All the blood is able to flow through. Second one, you start to see a little bit of buildup on the edges, but not too bad. It doesn't really affect the blood flow. Next one to the right, you see it gets bigger and the blood flow decreases. And on the far right, you can see it's actually so small that pretty much no blood is getting through. And that would be the point at which it's so bad that it could cause a heart attack or a stroke, because not enough blood is getting to either your heart if you're having a heart attack or your brain if you're having a stroke. So that's how that happens, and it builds up over time. It can be a slow progress, but oftentimes it goes unnoticed. So that's why it's so important that, you know, often when you get your blood tested, the doctor will be testing your LDL and HDL levels to make sure that you have a balanced amount of each and that you don't have a buildup in your blood vessels. All right, so with all that being said about cholesterol, we're now going to jump into the different types of fat. Okay, we have one question here though. Is this reversible with changes to cholesterol levels? It can be early on. So like I said, with HDL cholesterol, we have the ability to kind of pick cholesterol back up and remove it and take it to the liver and have it removed to the body. So if you do, you know, change your diet and consume foods that will help with your HDL cholesterol, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, if you really make those changes, especially early on, it actually can be reversible and you can bring your levels back to balance. So you can have higher levels of HDL, lower levels of LDL, which is what you want, and that can help to prevent further buildup and prevent a heart attack or a stroke. The actual plaque buildup is very hard to reverse. So, you know, if you're at this second stage here where there's just a little bit, if you were able to rebalance your HDL and LDL, that would prevent it from getting worse. But in most cases, it wouldn't actually make a difference in getting rid of the plaque that's already built up. So that's why it's really important to keep an eye on those levels and to try to eat the types of fats that are going to have a positive effect on your HDL and LDL levels. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so on to types of fats. So three main types of fats that we're going to talk about here. So we have saturated fat, we have unsaturated fat, and we have trans fat. And I'm not here to give you a chemistry lesson, but if we look here on the right, it just helps to kind of understand why each type of fat is a certain either solid or liquid at room temperature, like we were talking about. So from the quiz, we know that saturated fat is solid at room temperature and unsaturated fat is liquid at room temperature. And trans is actually, for the most part, also fairly solid at room temperature, although sometimes not as solid as saturated fat. So if we look, we can see that saturated fat is a very straight line of carbons and hydrogens for the most part. So if it's really, really straight, that means that each strand of fatty acid like that, they can kind of build up on top of each other. So if you imagine that you had 10 of those all built up on top of each other, they would be really very packed in. And if they're packed in and close to each other, because they're able to just lay directly on top of each other, that's how you get a solid form at room temperature, because it's really tight and close together, so it's solid. On the other hand, if we look at the unsaturated, we see that there's a kink in the shape. So that's called a double bond, and in this case, it's a cis double bond. Again, I'm not explaining all the chemistry to that. It can be a bit confusing, but all you need to know is that there's a kink in the chemical structure of an unsaturated bond, which means that if you were to try to layer a bunch of them on top of each other, there would be spaces in between, and it would be really difficult to get them really closely packed together, which is why unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. For example, oils, like olive oil or something. And an example for saturated fat would be butter, right? So that's kind of the difference that we're talking about here. In the case of trans fat, what we've done with the trans fat is actually made it more solid at room temperature. So we've taken a liquid fat and manually created it to be more solid. So you can see there's only a little bit of a kink, much less than in the unsaturated fat. And so we've chemically modified the fat to make it more solid. So that's what we've done in this case. I see I have a question here. What is the hype about coconut oil? If you don't mind, I'll leave that question for a little bit. And if I don't answer it, I will come back to it. But it doesn't quite fit in right here. I will try to answer that question though for sure, because that's a really good one. Okay, so that's really the chemical structure behind the reason why certain fats are liquid and certain fats are solid at room temperature. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense. I know it's a bit complicated, but it's just a bit of a foundation going forward. Okay, so we're going to talk first about unsaturated fat. So unsaturated fat is what is commonly known as the healthy type of fat. So it absolutely is. It is a really healthy type of fat. If we're consuming lots of unsaturated fat, then we're having lots of positive effects to our health. So if we think back to what I just explained about HDL and LDL, HDL is the good lipoprotein or good cholesterol, and we see increases in the good cholesterol when we consume unsaturated fat. In some cases, for certain types of unsaturated fat, we also actually see a decrease in the LDL or the bad cholesterol. So this type of fat can actually be kind of like a double agent. It's like it's doing both. It's increasing the good and it's decreasing the bad. So it's really doing exactly what we want it to do for our heart health. So if you were worried about your cholesterol levels, you would want to focus on consuming unsaturated fat as much as possible for your source of fat, because it's the best way to help rebalance those levels of cholesterol in the way that we want to have them. So these unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature, like I explained with the chemical structure. So any type of oil that you can imagine is an unsaturated fat. So really all oils have a large quantity of unsaturated fat in them. Fish also has unsaturated fat. I know obviously fish is solid, but the fat part of fish is liquid. It's kind of a bit weird to imagine that, but if you were to remove the fat part from the fish, it would be a liquid at room temperature. Same thing with avocado, although an avocado itself is solid, as well as nuts and seeds. The fat part of the structure of that food is a liquid. It's just mixed in with the rest of the parts of that food that make it a solid. So hopefully that helps a little. But if you've ever bought, for example, avocado oil, that would be the fat that comes from avocado, and it is in an oil form. And same thing with nuts and seeds. For example, let's say almonds, you can buy almond oil, right, for cooking or at the store. So that type of oil is coming from the almond, it's being removed from the almond, and the fat part that you're left with is a liquid at room temperature. So like I said, these are the healthiest types of fat, and they do a really great job at increasing the health of your cardiovascular system and helping to prevent further plaque buildup and preventing, ultimately, heart attacks and strokes, which is really, really great. That's exactly what we want. So when I started out this presentation and I said that fat is not all bad, this is really what I mean. This is a perfect example. Unsaturated fat is exactly a perfect example of why we need to consume fat. Because if we weren't to consume these things, we would not be getting all of these wonderful benefits that it brings for us. So really important to focus on these types of fats. Okay, moving on to the two types of unsaturated fats. So unsaturated fats can be divided into monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Essentially, that comes from the chemical structure. So mono means that there's only one double bond, and poly means that there's more than one double bond in the chemical structure. But really that doesn't matter because both of them have very positive effects on your cholesterol and your heart health. So we want to include both in a healthy, balanced diet. Sometimes people say that most of the fats that we consume, approximately 2/3, should come from monounsaturated. They have kind of the even higher health benefits, but both are really good. So personally, I wouldn't worry about trying to make, one way or the other. It's just good to focus on including both in a healthy diet. So some sources, just so you can have an idea of where to get them, of monounsaturated fats include olive oil. That's a really popular one. That's probably the oil that has the highest levels of monounsaturated fats, which is why it's highly recommended by dietitians. Other oils like peanut oil, canola oil, sesame oil, which I love, it's delicious, avocados or avocado oil, non-hydrogenated margarine, as well as nuts and seeds. And I'm going to talk about what non-hydrogenated margarine means when we talk about trans fat, but that's pretty much what you will find in the grocery store all the time now is non-hydrogenated margarine. So if you're buying margarine, it almost always is non-hydrogenated in Canada, and that's a good thing. So that means it has lots of monounsaturated fats. And then, like I said, also pretty much most nuts and seeds will also have monounsaturated fats. In terms of polyunsaturated, we have corn oil, safflower and sunflower oil, soybean oil, cottonseed oil, any type of fish, particularly the fattier fish, and I'll talk about some of those fish in a minute, as well as most nuts and seeds will also have polyunsaturated. So this section, the polyunsaturated, includes your omega-3 and your omega-6 fats. So that's where those ones fall under. So like I said, those two fats are unsaturated. Specifically, they're polyunsaturated. So they're both really great fats for our heart health. Wonderful. Okay, moving on. Okay, so what do I mean when I talk about essential fats? We mentioned it a little bit in the quiz at the beginning. Basically, an essential fat is a unsaturated fat, so it is a healthy, good type of fat, but it cannot be made in our bodies. Unfortunately, other types of fat our bodies are really great at making. We can create them, but these types of fats, we must get them from food. There's no way for us to have them unless we consume them in our diet. They are very important for many metabolic processes, so it is very important that we consume foods that have these essential fats. So the two that we're talking about, there's really fancy scientific names for them: alpha-linoleic acid, which is an omega-3 fat, and linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fat. So really, it's not so much important to remember exactly the type of omega-3 fat and omega-6 fat with those weird sciencey names, as long as you know that it's important to consume omega-3s and omega-6s. That's really what you should kind of take away, because sometimes it can be hard to really narrow down which ones you're getting. As long as you're eating foods with sources of those two types of fats, omega-3 and omega-6, you're also going to be getting your essential fats, so those two specific types of those fats. So some sources so that you kind of have an idea. I didn't put them on the slide because there's just too many, but I will read some out loud for you. So good sources of omega-3 fatty acids include your fatty fish. So when we're talking about fatty fish, that includes salmon, mackerel, anchovies, Arctic char, trout, and sardines. Those are really the big ones for getting high levels of omega-3 fats. So that would be where you would focus your fish choices if you're worried about getting omega-3s. Flaxseed are also a really great source of omega-3. However, they do have to be ground. So that's something that I always like to point out, because sometimes people just buy whole flax seeds and sprinkle them on everything thinking that they're getting lots of omega-3s. But unfortunately, that's not always the case if you don't grind them up, because the seed, the outer part of the seed is so solid that our bodies can't actually get to the fat in the middle if we don't grind them up. So that's just something to keep in mind. Walnuts are also a great source. Canola oil, soybean oil, tofu has omega-3s, and fortified foods. So for example, margarine or juice or yogurt or eggs, certain types of foods are actually fortified with omega-3. So that means they've been added into that food. So if it says that it has extra added omega-3, then it's probably a pretty good source. In terms of our linoleic acid, or our omega-6 fatty acids, sources for those would include vegetable oils like safflower, soybean, sunflower oil, corn oil. Walnuts would be a source of this as well, other nuts and seeds. And sometimes we can also get it from meat, poultry, and fish as well. So really there's so many sources, and I would say most of you probably include at least some of those types of foods in your diet, because there's a lot of different ways that you can get them, which is great because, like I said, it is really important that we do make sure we're consuming those types of fats. Of the two, typically omega-3 is a little bit more difficult for people to consume, in my experience, because really fish is probably the best source, and not everyone eats fish. So the recommendation is to consume fish 2 to 3 times a week in order to make sure that you're getting lots of omega-3, but I understand not everyone necessarily consumes fish, so you might have to get a little bit more creative. Like I said, with grinding flaxseed and sprinkling that on meals or whatever, adding it to smoothies, eating more nuts and seeds, putting it on your salads, or using fortified foods. So if you don't eat fish, it just might be worth keeping an eye out for those other types of foods that I just mentioned, because really the best way is through fish, but if you're not eating it, then it might be something worth paying attention to. Okay, Ben has a question. Do you recommend omega-3 supplements? That's a really good question, and it's really individualized. So I hesitate to give an answer to that, just because I don't know any of you personally. I don't know your diet, and so as a dietitian, I would prefer to sit down and actually find out what you eat to know whether or not you would need an omega-3 supplement. For the most part, most people probably don't need it. If it would be better to get it from your diet. But if you really find that you don't eat fish and you don't eat any of those other sources that I mentioned, or you just don't like them and you're not willing to consume those types of sources, in that case, then it might be something worth talking to. But I would recommend actually speaking with either your doctor or a registered dietitian if you're wondering if you need a supplement, rather than just going out and buying it on your own, because some people may not require it, and you always want to make sure you're saving money when you can too. So spending money on supplements if you don't need them is a bit of a pain. So I can't really give a specific answer. It would depend on what you eat and your individual situation. But if it is something that you feel that you're not getting enough of because you're not eating fish or any of those other sources, then I'd recommend asking a healthcare professional and seeing if you can't figure out whether that's a good option for you. So that's my advice there. Perfect. Okay. We'll move on now to saturated fat. So we're leaving unsaturated fat behind, and now we're talking about the second type of fat that I mentioned, saturated fat. So in terms of what this one does for our health, and specifically our heart health, saturated fat unfortunately does increase the LDL, or the bad cholesterol, in our bodies. So that part of consuming saturated fat is not ideal, right? It does lead to an increase in that type of cholesterol. So saturated fat is solid at room temperature. So when we're looking at where we get saturated fat, this picture shows a really good example of saturated fat. At the top of that steak there, you can see there's quite a large section of kind of that whitish opaque, and you can see it marbled in through the steak. It actually looks like probably it would be a pretty tasty steak. because it does have quite a bit of fat. So in any meat, if you see that white marbling, that is the fat in the meat, and that would be a source of saturated fat. Some dairy also has saturated fat unless it's fat-free dairy. So if you're consuming, for example, butter or yogurt or any milk that has a milk fat percentage in it, cheese, same thing, those are all sources of saturated fat. However, there are studies that are showing that dairy is perhaps not as harmful of a source of saturated fat as other sources like meat and other oils. So keep that in mind. It's preliminary research, but it is out there. So we're not really quite sure on that yet. Another source, so this is where I will bring in the question about coconut oil. So coconut oil is a form of saturated fat. So it's a bit odd, I will say, that coconut oil really did go through quite a hype. I'd say we're kind of on the other end of it now. People seem to be kind of forgetting about it for the most part, but there was a time there not too long ago where everyone seemed to think that we should all be eating saturated fat, coconut oil. But no one was really talking about the fact that coconut oil actually is a saturated fat. And we know that it's a saturated fat by using our test to see how it is at room temperature. And if you have ever had coconut oil in your cupboard at room temperature, not in the middle of the summer, but during a normal temperature day, it will be fairly solid at room temperature. And it only becomes liquid when you heat it up on your frying pan or on a hot summer day or whatever, then it will become a little bit more liquidy. But it is generally solid at room temperature. So that's how we know that it's a saturated fat by the easy test. Obviously, there's other ways to find out as well. But if you want to know quickly, then you just kind of look at, is it solid or is it liquid at room temperature? And this one is a saturated fat. So it really did get a bit of a health halo. For some reason, everyone was saying, oh, coconut oil is going to cure you of all ailments and it's the best and everyone should eat it. But that's not necessarily the case. There are certain nutrients and benefits that we can get from coconut oil as we can from a steak. Same thing, like there's lots of great nutrients that you can get when you consume a steak. So similar to that, I would never say, avoid steak altogether. I would never say avoid coconut oil altogether. It's just important to recognize that they are both sources of saturated fat, and saturated fat can have a negative effect on your cholesterol. So it really just comes down to consuming these foods in moderation and just knowing the science behind them and being aware of what effects it can have on your body and making decisions based on that. So for me, I definitely do eat steak and other meats that have saturated fat. I do use coconut oil sometimes because I enjoy the flavor. So if those are things that you enjoy, then go ahead, consume them. But just know that if you're looking for the healthiest type of fat, then it would be those other unsaturated fats that we just talked about and not so much these types of fat. That doesn't mean that we have to avoid them at all. Okay, and then we have another question here, Michelle, for dairy. How about 0% fat? So yeah, absolutely. There are lots of dairy products that are 0% fat. And in that case, you would not be getting any saturated fat. So if saturated fat is something that you are worried about, or if you have high levels of cholesterol and your doctor has told you to watch your fat intake for saturated fat, then maybe that's a good decision to make for yourself and have 0%. I personally find it doesn't taste as good, so I don't usually eat 0% fat. If you are eating it in moderation and you enjoy it, then that's fine. But if it's something that you're worried about, then that might be a good option to reduce your levels of saturated fat. Is there fat? I assume you mean fat substitute in 0% fat. I'm honestly not sure. There might be, but I don't know. I don't think so. There might be something like to substitute for the consistency, but I don't think there's any other type of fat, if that's what you mean, because otherwise it wouldn't be allowed to say 0% fat, I don't think. But I think it might depend on the brand, so maybe there's some that use some other type of substitute. To be honest, I really don't know. I'd have to look at the ingredient list in order to be able to tell you. So I'm not sure on that. But maybe if anyone has a 0% fat dairy product in their fridge, they can take a look and let us know what it says. Okay. So back to saturated fat. So those are the sources. That's my spiel on coconut oil. Hopefully that helps to answer that question about that. Palm oil is another one, basically your tropical oils, and lard is another example of a saturated fat. So these ones do increase your risk for heart disease when consumed in large amounts. And so they should be just eaten in moderation. They don't need to be avoided altogether, like I said, but do be aware of the effects of them and just eat them in moderation. Okay, here's just a quick little graph that shows you how much saturated fat is in different types of food. So as you can see, steak is pretty high, or pork or sausage meat, they all have approximately the same. In a 4-ounce serving, they would have 12 grams of fat. Keep in mind, though, that a 4-ounce serving is quite a small serving. Most people do not have a 4-ounce steak. Most T-bones at a restaurant would come in like a 12-ounce serving, which is really huge. So that would be a lot more saturated fat than just 12 grams, of course, if you're not eating the 4 ounces. So keep that in mind. So those are kind of the heavier sources of saturated fat. We do have some in cheese and other dairy products. So that cheese in particular would be 32% milk fat. Butter has a little bit, but not too much. And as we go down, certain other types of beef or pork tenderloin have less fat. And you can just tell, again, by looking at it and seeing how much of that whitish fat you can see on the meat. And chicken, most of the saturated fat is in the skin. So if you're buying skinless, boneless chicken breasts, then you're probably getting very little saturated fat. You can see here it's only 1. And then same thing, non-hydrogenated margarine, very little, and fish and legumes, very little. So that's kind of a rundown on the different sources and how much saturated fat you're getting. You can see that most sources are really not too high, other than your T-bone steak or your really fatty meats or your sausages, things like that. And I see we have another comment here that there's a substitute to offset this 0% similar to how. Yeah, I mean, that's entirely possible, that there's some sort of substitute in order to make the consistency right, but I just don't know what it is. And whatever it is, it wouldn't be fat. Like, it wouldn't be a type of fat. So in 0% sugar, they're using a sugar substitute that's not actual sugar, so it doesn't have the same effect in your body that sugar has. It's a substitute. So it would be kind of the same thing. That's my understanding of it. It would be just some other type of product that might help with the consistency, but that's not actual fat, if that makes sense. Okay, we'll move on. All right, third type of fat, we have trans fat. So trans fat is really the one that we should be avoiding altogether. But the good news is that we actually don't really have to worry about avoiding it here in Canada, because it was banned, and producers can no longer add trans fat in foods as of September 2018. So that is a fairly new regulation, and we are still in the process of phasing it in. So there still may be products on the shelves that were produced before September 2018 that have long shelf lives that may have trans fat in them, but anything that was made after September 2018 can no longer have any amounts of trans fat added to them as an additive of that product. So that's really great news. In terms of what trans fat is, it is, like I said when I showed you the chemical structure, it's mostly a man-made chemical structure. So we've taken a liquid fat and we've made it into a more solid fat so that it can be more easily added to foods like donuts, for example, or other baked goods or processed foods. So we've changed it into a more solid fat. And that's really not a natural thing for us to have done. So we did it thinking we were great and really smart, and it was really tasty, and it does really great things to food. It tastes great, it adds to the texture and all of that. But then later we found out that it actually is really quite detrimental to our health. So when we talk about trans fat, it does the same thing that saturated fat does in terms of, if we go back here, I'll just remind you, saturated fat, we see that it increases the bad cholesterol, the LDL. And if we come back here to trans fat, we also have an increase in LDL, bad cholesterol. But in addition to that, we see a decrease in the HDL, or the good cholesterol. So it does both of the bad things that we don't want, as opposed to unsaturated fat, which does both of the good things that we do want. So it's really working really hard to hurt your health in many ways. So there's really no need for us to be using it, because it was a man-made product to begin with. It's unnecessary. It does not need to be part of our diets. And that was why Health Canada made the decision to ban it as a food additive. I will also mention, though, that there are some foods that naturally do have trans fats. For the most part, these fall under the categories of dairy and meat. So these types of foods do have some, but these do not have the same type of detrimental effect on your health as the man-made ones do. So it's really not quite as much to worry about when you see it in these natural foods like dairy or meat. It's not something that you should be too concerned about, and it's usually in such small amounts that you really don't need to worry about it too much. So another thing that was really used commonly for trans fats was margarine. So margarine used to be made of trans fats, or what we call partially hydrogenated oils. So now on your margarine, you'll see it actually says non-hydrogenated. So they're advertising that they're no longer using those partially hydrogenated oils, and they're using more natural non-hydrogenated oils rather than the man-made trans fats. So that's really good. You can take a look for that on your margarine. Mostly they will all say that because, like I said, they are no longer allowed to use trans fats. So now all margarine is no longer using trans fats, which is really great because margarine sometimes does have a bit of a bad rap. And that's the reason why, because it used to be not the greatest because of the way that we made it, but now we found a way to make it more naturally using non-hydrogenated oil, which is wonderful. Okay, moving on from trans fats. So here we have a quick little, I just saw one more question pop up. I'll answer that before I move on here. Is margarine now better to use than butter? That is certainly the million-dollar question. It depends on your perspective. I would argue that it is from a perspective of fat, because margarine is a source of unsaturated fat. And actually, we have it here on our chart. So let's start looking at it now. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see just partway down from the top, it says non-hydrogenated margarine. So that's the type of margarine that I'm talking about that exists now without the trans fat. So you'll see it actually has no trans fat. Trans fat is the really deep, deep red, and there's none of that. And there's lots of unsaturated. The yellow and the green together are the two types of unsaturated, and only a little bit of saturated, so really not too bad. So that's a really great source of fat. As we can see, it's got lots of the healthy unsaturated. And now if we look, I think, yep, butter is the second from the bottom, and you'll see that it has much less of the yellow and green, the unsaturated fats, and much more of the saturated fat. And then you'll see too the tiny little bit, 6% of trans fat. That's the natural trans fat that exists in butter that I was talking about. It does have a different effect on our health. So those natural trans fats do not increase our risk of heart disease. So that we're not worrying about that 6% of trans fat, but we are looking at the large 64% of saturated fat in butter. So if you look at it from a perspective of healthy fats, it's fairly obvious that non-hydrogenated margarine is a better choice from that perspective. However, some people might argue that butter is more natural because it comes from an animal, I guess, but I mean, margarine comes from plant oil now, so that's pretty natural. If you ask me, it's still being processed, but so is butter. Butter is processed in order to make it butter. So really, it comes down to personal preference, but from a healthy fat perspective, I would argue that you're getting more unsaturated fat from margarine, therefore it would be considered healthier. Hopefully that answers your question and didn't confuse you too much. Okay, so we're gonna look at a few other different fats on this graph as well. So I've already kind of explained what we're looking at. So yellow and green are the healthy fats, red and deep red are the less healthy fats, you could say. And so you want to look for fats that have a higher total unsaturated fat percentage and less of the saturated fat, and hopefully zero or very little of the trans fat. You'll see that there is hard margarine on here that has 31% trans fat. That's the old way that we used to make our margarine. We don't do that in Canada anymore, so that's really not relevant, but that's how much trans fat you would have been getting from margarine if it was using trans fat. Okay, so that's that. Let's take a look at olive oil. I want to point that one out. So it is the highest in monounsaturated fat. As you can see, it has 75% of the green bar, 11% of poly, which is great as well, and only 14% of the unsaturated fat. So that's the main reason why olive oil is so popular, because it has the highest level of monounsaturated fat, which many will argue is the absolute best type of fat that you can have for your health. It's really, really great. So that's wonderful. It's a great fat. And I see we have a question here about olive oil. Does the health effects of olive oil change with cooking? And no, it does not. That's a myth. I get that a lot. People tend to think that by heating up olive oil, it will somehow make it less healthy. The only concern with cooking with oils is making sure that you're aware of the smoke point. And the smoke point basically just means at what temperature does the oil start to burn or start to smoke. So as long as you're not reaching the smoke point, and there's a different smoke point for every type of oil, including olive oil, as long as you're not reaching that and end up burning your food, there's really no reason to worry about the health effects of cooking with olive oil or any other type of oil. Michelle, I am glad you liked the graph. I might be able to find the link for it at the end here. If you want, I can send it in the chat at the end of the presentation. If you wanted to stick around for a second, I should be able to find it fairly quickly. So if you want to remind me at the end, I can definitely do that and send you guys the link, because it is a pretty interesting graph. Okay, what else should we look at? So we can see that there's a very small amount of trans fat in canola oil and soybean oil. This is due to the extraction process, and it's such a small amount that these oils are still considered healthy. 2% is very minimal and does not have a large effect. Animal fats like butter and beef tallow, which is also on there, are not, interestingly, exclusively saturated fat. So they do contain some amounts of unsaturated fat, but they just have higher amounts of saturated fat. So really all oil has some of every type of fat. So it's not always as simple as saying that oils are all unsaturated and animal fat is all saturated, because they all have some of everything. It's more just which one they have more of, that's how we categorize them. Okay, any questions about any of those that you see on there? Does that all make sense? You can see coconut oil down there at the bottom has a huge amount of saturated fat, so that kind of drives that point home about coconut oil. Pretty high. Definitely not something we want to eat all the time. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so now we're just going to talk about the guidelines for consuming fat. So these are the general guidelines that are recommended for how much fat we consume and of which types and all of that. So for every day, the guideline is to consume 65 grams or less of fat. That one I don't really care so much about, just because that's a fairly easy goal to achieve. I'd say few people would eat much more than that. But what's really important to note is to make sure that you're having less than 20 grams of saturated and trans fat. Well, the trans fat is probably not too difficult to do for us Canadians, because we don't really get it anymore in any of our products. But making sure that you're limiting your saturated fat to 20 grams or less a day whenever possible. And you can do that by reading the nutrition label to find out how much fat is in that food. And I did a webinar on nutrition label reading, which I think should be posted on CAF Connections by now. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go ahead and watch that webinar. And then you want to try to have at least 3 to 6 teaspoons of healthy fat, so your unsaturated fats and oils, every day in order to reach your optimal heart health. But keep in mind that 3 to 6 teaspoons isn't necessarily all added fats, because some will come naturally in the foods that you eat, like your nuts or your seeds or your fish or whatever it may be. So it's not that you have to add 3 to 6 teaspoons to the different types of foods that you cook throughout the day. You can just include whatever foods that you're eating that have natural sources of that fat. And then in terms of choosing lower fat, it's most important, you can see I bolded one of them, which is to have 2 grams or less of saturated and trans fat. And I wouldn't worry so much about the other ones in terms of having less overall fat, because we do want to make sure that we still are including the healthy fats, right? So if they have lots of unsaturated fat, then that's something that you do want to consume. So I wouldn't worry too much about limiting those. You really more want to focus on limiting your saturated and your trans fat to 2 grams or less. Okay. So here we have, just for fun, another little poll that I'm going to put for you. So my question here, we have 2 yogurts, A and B, And I want to know, based on those recommendations that I just went over, which yogurt you would choose based on fat. So not looking at any of the other ingredients, which one would you choose by looking at fat? There's a poll there available now. Okay, looks like most of you have chosen yogurt A. I would agree that this would be the best yogurt to choose if you're worrying about fat. And there's a couple reasons. First of all, it does have lower overall fat, but even more importantly, it has significantly less saturated fat, so 2 grams versus 6 grams, and it has no trans fat, whereas the other one has 1 gram of trans fat. So we want to make sure we're getting as little trans fat as possible, so that's a really important point as well. So really lower fat overall, but more importantly, lower fat in the types of fat that we want to avoid. So there you go. Okay, so where should we focus when we're looking for healthy fats? Just as a quick summary, you want to choose fats or foods, sorry, with unsaturated fats such as fish, with like salmon, rainbow trout, herring, and tuna, like I mentioned. Nuts such as unsalted walnuts, almonds, and pecans. Seeds like flax seeds, pumpkin seeds, sesame seeds, and sunflower seeds. And all kinds of plant oils, vegetable oils, olive oils, anything that you enjoy the flavor of. And lastly, non-hydrogenated margarine is a great source of unsaturated fat as well, like I mentioned. Okay, so that's pretty well the end of our fat presentation. I do want to put a bit of a plug in for my next 2 presentations, which are coming up in the next 2 weeks. So we have focus on carbohydrates and focus on protein. Carbohydrates is next week, Wednesday, May 20th. Protein is the week after, Wednesday, May 27th. They're both at the same time as it was today. Whatever time zone you're in, it will be the same time. So I'm going to post a link here to both of them. Hopefully you can get it. There's the carbohydrate one. If you click the register button, you'll be able to register for that. And then I think I should be able to share. Oh, shoot. Did that make the carbohydrate one disappear for you guys too? I think it did. Okay, well, there's the protein one. Everyone maybe register for that one first, and then I'll put the carb back on, because I think it looks like I can't have both of them. Maybe I can, I don't know. Let me know if you can see both of them. Oh, it looks like it did get rid of it. Okay, so everyone go and register for protein if you're interested, and then I'll put back the carbohydrate one, and you can register for that one as well, so that you can all join me for the next 3 weeks in our nutrition topics. It'd be lots of fun, trust me. Okay, good. We've got 20 people who've clicked register so far. Looking good. Awesome. 23. Good stuff. Okay, I'm going to put the other one back up so people can register. And then if you want me to put the protein one back up later, I can again. Here's the carbohydrate one. So you can go ahead and register for that one. Awesome. And please do stick around. I have a few other poll questions that we are required to get answers from you. So don't leave quite yet if you don't mind. That would be awesome. Just a few more minutes. I know I'm a bit over my hour time. I tend to do that. I talk a lot. But we do have just a few other questions for you, and then you will be free to go. If you need to go, though, that's fine. I completely understand. So I'm going to leave that one up there for the carbohydrates. If you want the protein one again in a minute, you can have it. I'll give it to you. But first, let's do these other statistics polls. So first of all, we would love to know if you feel that you can apply to what you learned today in your daily living. So again, this is completely anonymous. We won't know who has answered what. And I just want to point out that the most negative answers are going to be at the top and the most positive answers are at the bottom. We've had some issues with people accidentally clicking the first answer thinking it's the strongly agree or whatever, the positive one, when in fact it's the negative one, and that's caused some confusion. So please do read all of the answers before you give your answer to this poll. So it's going live now, and you can go ahead and answer that. Okay, and as you're finishing up that, I'm going to add one more poll. So the next one here is for the Demio platform. So Demio is the platform that we've been using for this presentation. So we just want to know how satisfied you are with this platform. So one more poll there. Same thing, the negative answers are at the top, positive at the bottom. So go ahead and you can give your answer for that one as well. It'd be great if everyone who's still left could give me an answer for both of these. I'd really appreciate it. And if you still haven't given me an answer for the first poll that we did about your affiliation with the CAF, then I'd appreciate if you could go back to that very first poll and make sure you have answered that one as well. That would be great. Okay. Michelle, what do you mean when you say there's nowhere to go? Is one of the links not working? Maybe she's gone. Okay, well, hopefully the links are working. And Rochelle, I see you've asked, is eating canned and tuna and salmon okay as well versus fresh? Definitely, absolutely. The only thing I'd advise when you're looking at anything canned is just making sure that you're checking to see about added ingredients. So sometimes they add like all kinds of extra salt or sugar or whatever it is to their different canned goods. So making sure that they don't have too much of those added ingredients. But it's a great way, really affordable way to get your healthy fats through canned fish. Okay, let's see. I have some more comments here. Oh, you mean that we can't go outside? Okay. Fair enough. That's fine too. There is nowhere for any of us to go. Absolutely. Okay, Joanne, great question here too. I thought higher fat dairy was better than low fat for young kids. Yes, that is correct. Absolutely. So if they're still growing, they do need fat. So higher fat is better for them. It will also help to keep them full and nourished. So don't be skimping out and giving your children skim milk. There's really no reason for that. When they're still growing, they do need the higher fat. So great question. Thank you for asking that. Like I said, this presentation is aimed towards adults, so I'm not really talking about children in this case, but absolutely, that's an important note. Wonderful. Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, then oh, looks like Ben is asking. About additives that we should stay clear from. I mean, I wasn't really necessarily referring to anything in particular. To be honest, I don't really buy canned fish, so I'm not exactly sure. I just mean in general, you want to make sure there's not huge amounts of, for example, added salt. I don't even know if they add salt to fish. They probably do in some cases. So just things like that, just to be aware of, but nothing really specific that I had in mind. So hopefully that helps a little bit. All right. Wonderful. So that's it from me. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask. This last slide here is some resources for you in case you need help with anything. There's lots of resources that are available during this difficult time with coronavirus. So lots of links and phone numbers that you can call for help if you need them. So feel free to take a photo of this slide if you want to have that information. It's there for you. That's what it's there for, to support you during this time. So please do make use of it if you feel that you need it. All right, and then finally, that's it. So any final questions, feel free to ask. Michelle, I see your reminder there about the fat graph. I will go and find that for you right now and link it in here. And then I'll come back and see if there are any other questions from anybody else. Thanks so much. I'll be right back. Okay, so I was not able to find the exact one that we use in our presentation. I think it might have been made by someone through CFMWS. So anyway, I do know that the canola website for canola oil has a very similar one. The numbers might be a little bit different, but I am going to send you that one. Just know that it's not the one that I used. So just as a disclaimer, it may not be exactly the same, and I'm not endorsing it. I'm just sending you the one I was able to find really quickly. So hopefully it does help. There's other similar graphs that are available if you just Google fat comparison, but there's that one from the canola website, if that helps. Hopefully it does. And Joanne, I see you just wanted me to reiterate, so mono versus polyunsaturated. I'm not even sure I would say that one is better. Typically the monounsaturated ones are the ones that people suggest that you would consume more of. They do have slightly more benefits, I guess you could say, but they're both unsaturated fat and they're both healthy and they're both going to have the same positive effects on your heart health. So I wouldn't worry too much about the difference between them as long as you're getting both in your diet. That's what's important. But mono is typically the one that people focus on a little bit more. So hope that helps. Alrighty. So I guess that's it from me. Have a wonderful day, everybody. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope I'll see you back next week for our topic of carbohydrates. Thanks so much.